Good evening, class. My name is Barry Gadsden, and tonight I'm going to be talking about the increasing role of money in U.S. federal elections and how our current campaign finance system has struggled to keep up with that growth. I'll briefly explain how we got to the system we have today, why I believe there are both market and government failures involved, and then I'll compare 4 policy alternatives that address the problem. The easiest way to understand the policy problem is to start with how much election spending has changed. In the 2000 election cycle, total federal election spending was around $3 billion. By 2024, that number had grown to about $14.8 billion. And during the 2023-2024 election cycle alone, independent expenditures exceeded $4.4 billion. But the problem isn't that elections are expensive. The bigger questions are, where is all this money coming from? Who is behind it? And do voters actually know who is trying to influence them? That will be the focus of my analysis. When we look at where this independent spending is coming from, super PACs play a major role. Super PACs are a type of political committee in the United States that can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money to influence elections. During just the 2023-2024 election cycle, they spent about $2.72 billion independently, or roughly 62% of all independent expenditures reported to the Federal Election Commission. We also see a pretty large difference in who actually contributes money to politics. For example, 32% of Americans with family incomes above $150,000 reported making a political donation, compared with only 7% of Americans earning less than $30,000. Obviously, elections affect all of us. But under our current system, most of the money influencing those elections is coming from a small group of wealthy donors. So why should we actually care about this? One reason is public trust. Researchers found that when people believe money has too much influence in politics, they are less likely to believe government is responsive to ordinary citizens. And this isn't a small concern. Pew Research Center found that approximately 80% of Americans say that people who donate a lot of money to campaigns have too much influence on decisions made by members of Congress. To understand how we got here, we have to start with the Federal Election Campaign Act, or FECA. FECA created the foundation of our current system by establishing contribution limits, disclosure requirements, and creating the FEC to enforce those rules. But the landscape changed after the Citizens United versus FEC in 2010. The Supreme Court ruling allowed corporations and labor unions to make unlimited independent expenditures to campaigns as a form of protection on their rights to freedom of speech. But direct contributions to candidates remained limited. Afterward, states that previously restricted this type of spending saw independent expenditures increase by 127%. This initiated the rise of super PACs and their influence on our elections. This brings us to market failures. The first is information asymmetry, which simply means voters don't always know who is actually funding political ads. This is where dark money comes in. Dark money groups have spent more than $4.3 billion since 2010, including a record $1.9 billion in 2024. The second is a negative externality. Even if we don't donate to campaigns ourselves, political spending can influence elections and government policies that affect all of us. Then we also have government failures. Congress has tried to regulate campaign finance through FECA, but the current system has some major limitations. One is regulatory failure. Although direct contributions to a candidate are limited, independent spending is unlimited. And there's the constitutional problem. Because of the Citizens United, Congress can't simply pass a law tomorrow saying we're going to ban or broadly limit independent political spending, because the Supreme Court's decision granted independent political spending as a First Amendment right to corporations and labor unions. So now the policy question is, how do we improve transparency and accountability without violating constitutionally protected political speech? To answer that question, I looked at 4 different options. The first option is pretty straightforward. Do nothing major and maintain the status quo. We keep FECA, the FEC, the existing disclosure system, and unlimited spending. The second option is the one I ultimately recommend, that's strengthen the disclosure requirements for independent expenditures. Instead of telling organizations they can't spend money, this approach focuses on telling voters where that money actually came from. So if dark money is being funneled through a nonprofit or another intermediary, there would be stronger requirements to disclose the original source of where that money is coming from. The third alternative is restructuring the FEC. Right now, there are 6 commissioners, which means they can split 3 to 3. My alternative would reduce that number from 6 to 5 so that you could no longer have 3 to 3 enforcement deadlocks. And the last alternative is by far the biggest change, and that's amending the Constitution to give Congress and the states greater authority to regulate campaign spending. So I intentionally looked at options ranging from basically changing nothing all the way to changing the Constitution. To evaluate these alternatives, I used 5 criteria: political feasibility, administrative feasibility, cost, effectiveness, and transparency and accountability. I ranked each alternative high, medium, or low. And what I found is that there's no perfect option. For example, the status quo does well when it comes to feasibility and cost, and that makes sense because we're already doing it, but it doesn't solve the problem we started with. The constitutional amendment is almost the opposite. It could be very effective because it will give Congress much more regulatory authority, but actually getting a constitutional amendment adopted is extremely difficult. So this alternative ranks low on political and administrative feasibility. So the question became, which option actually improves the system while still having a realistic path toward implementation? And that's why my final recommendation is alternative 2, strengthen disclosure requirements for independent expenditures. This alternative wasn't perfect across the board. I ranked political feasibility as medium because there's support for disclosure reform, but there's also opposition. We've actually seen this with proposals like the Disclose Act. There are lawmakers and campaign finance reform groups that support greater donor transparency, while opponents raise concerns about donor privacy and First Amendment rights. I also ranked administrative feasibility as medium and cost as low. Yes, the FEC would have more information to process, and yes, organizations would have additional reporting requirements, but the advantage is that we already have an FEC. We already have an electronic campaign finance reporting system, so we're not building an entirely new system from scratch. We're expanding something that already exists. But the biggest reason I chose alternative 2 is that it ranked high in both effectiveness and transparency and accountability. Research by Dowling and Miller found that when voters receive information about where campaign funding is coming from, it can actually affect how they evaluate candidates and even their voting intentions. So disclosure isn't just about putting more numbers into an FEC database. It's about giving voters information that they can actually use. And when I compared that to the other alternatives, that's what made alternative 2 stand out. The status quo is easy, but it doesn't fix the transparency gap. Reducing the FEC from 6 commissioners to 5 could help with enforcement, but it doesn't necessarily tell us who is funding political spending. And a constitutional amendment could potentially address the amount of money being spent, but realistically, it's extremely difficult to pass. Alternative 2 gives us a middle ground. We're not saying that corporations, nonprofits, or individuals can't participate in political speech. We're not necessarily telling them how much money they can independently spend. We're saying something much simpler. If you're going to spend billions of dollars for federal elections, then at minimum, voters should have enough information to understand who is trying to influence their vote. Thank you.